signing table. And you can also buy books in the wonderful bookshop outside the Brewery Arts Centre too. So I'm now going to live out a small portion of my first childhood career dream of being a flight attendant by running through some practicalities. So please put all your electronic devices into flight mode or switch them off entirely. You don't need them on the journey we're about to take. The exits are, I was going to say here and here, but they're just there. And volunteers are here for any assistance. We'll be cruising at an altitude somewhere between the Cairngorms and the height of Everest, which, as I learnt from this book, increases slightly every year. And you'll be pleased to know that your journey has a much smaller carbon footprint than flying. And instead of getting there exhausted and knackered, you're going to be uplifted by the readings from the book and hopefully from our conversation as well. And if you want to ask questions at the end, we'll have 10-15 minutes for that too. My name's Helen, and you'll be shocked to hear that I have no flying experience because I'm in fact a poet. But I think it's fair to say I wouldn't have wanted to become a writer at all, and certainly not one who writes about climbing and mountain environments if it were not for Robert Macfarlane and for this book in particular. Best-selling author, activist, teacher, climber, really good trail runner, as I found out in the trail run this morning. There's nothing that Robert doesn't do. His work expertly navigates the relationship between people and environment, from the wild places and the Cambridgeshire countryside to the subterranean world of Underland. He's innovative, intellectually restless, original and tireless in his commitment to interrogating what language can do to make us connect more, care more, think more deeply. This was perhaps best encapsulated in some of his remarkable work with Jackie Morris in The Lost Words. And Robert was very cagey about calling the spells in The Lost Words poetry, but he is a true poet. And that poet's eye and heart have always been in evidence in his work from the publication of Mountains of the Mind, when it came out in 2003, a book I'll never forget reading and thinking, I want to write like that. So some favourite phrases that I thought I'd introduce this afternoon's event with, the little details that stay with you that are picked out in really great mountaineering and climbing writing. A square yard of silver mica seething brightly in the sunlight. It was like opening a book to find a mirror leafed inside it. A little yellow alpine flower tucked into a pocket of rock. And late summer light filling miles of landscape like an inexhaustible liquid. So please welcome Robert Macfarlane to talk about mountaineering. And we're going to start with a reading, I think, if that's okay, to illustrate some of that poetry.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rob, and I'm very, very happy to be here. It's slightly ambivalent feeling about realising that the first book I wrote has turned 20. I'm really old now. I'm particularly so. Thank you to Kendall for suggesting this event, and to you all for coming, and to Helen. I can't think of anyone I'd rather be in conversation with. We've been friends for a long time. We've climbed together in Greenland, and whatever she says, she got me around the trail race today, and we crossed the line with our arms around each other's shoulders. So it's lovely to go from the limestone scarp to the stage this morning. And Helen is herself an absolutely extraordinary writer about mountains. So we'll hear, I hope, from her about these questions as well. Just a note of bathos amid all of this. So thank you for picking out some of the nice phrases in here. When it turned 20, I had to reread it, and that was a mixed experience. But it reminded me that one of the very first events I did around this book was at a kind of psychoanalyst institute in London, and it was a surprising event, partly because the first question that I was asked, ambushed on stage, was when the interviewer read out a passage from the book in which I'm sort of traversing a snow ridge in the Alps, and I'm going I've got one axe and one kind of gloved hand that I'm driving in. It's a bit soft and mushy, and I'm front pointing in and just trying to traverse. And he said, yeah, this very interesting phrase, I mean, particularly in the context of psychoanalysis. You say you looked between your legs and saw a whole lot of nothing. And I was like, All right. Okay. This event is not going to go how I expected, but there was a whole mountain as breast thing. It was full psychoanalysis all the way. So anyway, I recovered from that. I thought I'd read. I mean, every book has a kind of origin story, I guess, and particularly first books. How long did they take to write? I started writing this when I was 23, and it was published, I think, when I was 27. And so in that sense, it did take 27 years to write, 27 years of mountains. My parents are here today, and they, from a very young age, we were going up to eat Bakewell slices on windy Irish and Welsh and Lakeland mountain tops. So they gave me the love of the hills. So that's the true origin story, I guess. But one is also just coming face to face with the absolute strangeness of mountain worship. And this is from 1999, when I led a drastically underexperienced small team of fellow climbers to Kyrgyzstan, to the Tian Shan Mountains. And we got a Russian helicopter flight up the Inalchek Glacier, and it dropped us at a sort of ragtag base camp. And I'd seen the helicopter pilot basically taping the back rotor on with gaffer tape that morning. So just getting to the base camp felt like a bit of an achievement. And then I was immediately really sick with altitude sickness. So I was wandering around the camp before we started climbing. Later that day, once we'd set up our tents, I followed a faint track which led up the moraine towards China. After half a mile or so, it turned behind a rocky spur and into a glacial cirque. I stood and watched the business of the cirque for a while, chunks of serac carving from a small hanging glacier, leaving patches of fresh blue ice behind them, a chough with its bright orange beak mewing to an invisible mate, a rough pyramid of shale shivering and reassembling itself as the main glacier shifted beneath it. As I walked on, the flimsy sunlight flashed off something close to me. There was a small metal plaque fastened to an outcrop of mud-brown rock, and another, and another. I walked over to the rock. It was a cemetery for those who died on these mountains. There were 15 plaques bolted to the rock, 31 names. Most of the dead were Russian. There was also a German, 2 Americans, and an Englishman. Niches had been chipped into the rock beneath all but one of the Russian plaques, and objects had been placed in them as offerings or elegies in a grim haberdashery of death. There was a cheap plastic doll with peroxide blonde hair and a scarlet dress that was startling against the quiet tones of the rock. 2 blackened candle wicks sat in a fat puddle of red wax, a brittle head of something like Edelweiss, a ceramic Madonna permanently weeping tiny lapis tears. The Englishman had no niche, just a plaque on which rust was dully blooming. Paul David Fletcher, Tian Shan, 16th of August, 1989, it read. And below that, Anglichanin, Englishman. Why had he come here? I wondered briefly. What had he expected to find in this place? Not death, certainly. And my mind kept returning to the plaques I'd seen, particularly to Fletcher's, I suppose because of the automatic selfishness of memory, because he of all the dead resembled me the most closely. I wondered again what 10 years ago had drawn him to the Tian Shan, thousands of miles from England. What had he imagined that inaccessible landscape held for him? And it was sort of that, and of course, then you turn that question upon yourself and you realize that you're repeating this movement, and that the intensity of that fascination suddenly looked at from the outside just seems mad. Why would you risk yourself? So that was the sort of crank handle, or one of several crank handles or turns to those that sort of got the engine of, like, how do we explain this madness historically, personally, aesthetically?
And you talk about this in the preface to the new edition of the book a bit, but it'd be really interesting to hear a bit about what you were doing 20 years ago when this book came about, in terms of your climbing. Obviously, some of that's there, but also your reading and your writing. Where were you when this book formed itself?
Yeah. Well, I'm a terrible climber. Just like full disclosure, no, I mean full transparency. Not that anyone doubts it, but this isn't a book written by a good climber. I mean, in a way, that's that's part of the point, is that I didn't, in many ways, the mountains would always be exceeding my capacity to, certainly as a younger sort of mountaineer and climber, I was always out of my depth or out of my height. And I wrote some of this book in China, actually. I have this very strong memory. I had like 3 books with me. I was teaching at a university in Beijing. It was over the winter. It was really, really cold. And one of the books was an anthology of mountain writing that my mum and dad had given me, sort of 1940s, I think it was. And that became a sort of source book for tracing some of these ideas as they emerged in culture, in imagination, in history, and gradually began to gain. I imagine there's these tributaries. You have sort of romanticism beginning to you have geology dreaming a deeper time to the earth, people starting to move up with scientific aspirations into the Alps. You have an increased sort of leisure capacity within the 19th century. There's economic drivers, and slowly all of these ways of feeling, as structures of feeling, as Raymond Williams would call them, begin to gather and drive into this, all of the things that we're all involved with now. So George Mallerie became a key figure. Like, why did he go back and back and back? And then my own experiences sort of 60 years later. But I remember writing some of it, and outside my window in China in this compound, every morning at about 5 a.m., this amazing dancer would appear with swords, wearing green, and these flashing swords do this beautiful sort of qigong motion. And so I have this very strong early memory of trying to make sense of how to tell this story while this amazing, graceful sword dance was going on outside. And then I wrote the bulk of it in a basement in Cambridge, the flattest part of the country. You can fax it. It's, I was below sea level. And actually, I think there's an intensity to that summoning back. It's a much lesser version of what happened to W.H. Murray when he was in the prisoner of war camp, writing Mountaineering in Scotland, the most kind of modestly named but visionary work of mid-century mountain literature, I think. So, yeah. It's
unusual, isn't it, that thing of, I feel this very much as well, that it's easier to write about places when you're away from them somehow. It's the distance and the perspective. But also being struck by how, as you say in the book, how for many of us, the first kind of fascination with mountaineering is through mountain literature. It's through those classic stories and through the reading about the adventures of others, which is why it's such a particular genre, isn't it? It's such a... because that was true for you. You were reading some of those texts and doing the kind of... I don't like calling it armchair adventuring, because it's more than that, but that kind of imaginative journey into mountains.
Well, yes, there's a lot of that. The opening of the book is set in my grandparents' house in the Cairngorms, and this big kind of... My grandfather was a mountaineer and a diplomat, and he had a big mountaineering and exploration library, so I'd sort of go and pull these books off the shelf, and I pulled the Fight for Everest, the big, massive hardback account of the third Everest expedition, the 24 expedition, which I still have. It was one of those books which has these amazing fold-out maps that kind of come out of the end papers and then turn into a kind of half an acre of cartography. It's really beautiful, and something about... Because, with the young imagination as well, they have the force of fairy tale, I think, and you're not alert to the ethical problems, to the colonial tones, and all of that stuff was invisible to me. I just saw these extraordinary... I mean, they were astronauts. They were astronauts. They went into space. Climbing Everest at that time in the 20s was as extreme, I think, as exploration got. And nobody knew what was happening to the body up there. So there was a pure vision of excitement that, kind of vaulted through me. But actually that needed unlearning. It took a long time to unlearn it and kind of fall into a slightly more critical, reflective relationship with it.
And going back, going back to you sitting at your desk in China with the amazing dance outside, or in the basement in Cambridge, what the kind of line by line process of writing about mountain landscapes.
Yeah.
Do you think that writing about those environments kind of invites a different kind of a different way of looking from other writing? The examples, one of the examples I was quoting at the beginning is from this lovely section that you've got about the mica.
Oh yeah.
And on,
yeah.
is it
Ben Lawes?
Ben Lawes? And I think that's a lovely example of how writing about these environments can almost mimic the act of climbing. It's that very close-up physical engagement. It feels like sometimes writing about climbing feels like a pitch on a climb with a crux and with the kind of series of moves. And I wondered if you think there's something qualitatively different about the way you write about mountains from other things.
From other things, yes, not from other people, I think. Sometimes writing about ice and light and snow and rock and gravity and fear, sometimes it's like trying to climb water. Like you take a handful and it's impossible to ascend, and actually then you realise that what you have to do is start swimming rather than start climbing. And language will never stick. Language is always late for its subject, whatever subject that is, but even more so in terms of light. I think that's the way I always think of it. Is how do you write light? And then I think the futility of the endeavour is no cause to abandon it. But it's to continue to think about how language can jump and spring, and that's why the writers who set me going were people like Seamus Heaney, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Heaney in this wonderful kind of palp and heft of a haptic, tactile language of whether that was slime and mud and peat and bog, or light, or the rust on a grain shovel. So there was something about that precision as a form of lyricism that was very exciting to me. And then you've got someone like Hopkins who's just breaking language open, smashing words into one another to make new words, inventing basically improvisational jazz as a Catholic theologian in the 1860s, writing in a Dublin seminary with sprung rhythm. So yeah, there's the kind of tactile evocative, and then there's the jump it all around in the house. Hopkins, yeah.
And Barry Lopez was the author who sort of, is it fair to say, made you fall in love with non-fiction as a form that could be, that could have a lot of potential? I think I remember reading in Mountains of the Mind that you used to have a hierarchy of, like, poetry was at the top, and then fiction, and then non-fiction at the bottom. What was it about Lopez, and is it Arctic Dreams in particular?
Yes, it was Arctic Dreams. I suddenly realised about 5 years ago, why do we this weird word non-fiction? It's like we define it negatively. It's the sort of embarrassing relative to fiction. You know, when the guests come round, fiction tells non-fiction to get in the cupboard or the side room or something. It's like, we won't mention non-fiction. So a very odd negative definition of a vast, capacious, endlessly creative space, which has a responsibility to fact, which I think is becoming only more and more and more important, but which can pull in modes and threads and possibilities from poetry, from fiction. And I remember, seeing what Barry did in Arctic Dreams, and I was able to tell him that in the correspondence we had for several, 5 or 6 years, and then finally in person not long before he died on Christmas Day in 2020, and that he just cracked the egg for me. I was just like, you can do pretty much anything in this form. So I've always wanted to keep kneading the dough and not. It's very easy to become fluent in one's own vernacular, but actually that way ossification and boredom lies. It's
a bit of a. I'm making a bit of a lazy analogy here, but there's there does seem to me to be a similarity between risk-taking in climbing and risk-taking in writing. That's one of the things that makes writing about adventure so compelling. Yeah, and as you say, to keep taking risks, whatever they may mean for you as a writer, is important.
Yeah.
I wondered if I could ask you a bit about how Mountains of the Mind engages with risk and how it's influenced your own, or how your own kind of relationship with risk has evolved in the time since you've written it. I was very struck by the idea of Coleridge having basically made one of the first rock climbs on Scar Fell, but also his attitude to risk, which is extraordinary. He just lies down. And I think the way you write about risk is very nuanced. It's sort of understanding why people do it, but also putting perhaps the selfishness of it in context. I'm not sure what my question is here, but it's more a topic.
And it's one you've written about so well, about motherhood, parenthood. I mean, this book was published 3 months before our first child, Lily, was born. She was born in September 2003. And so I sometimes describe this as my resignation letter to serious mountaineering, because there was no, I had no appetite then for risk. I still have an appetite for fear, because I think it's a very interesting thing to experience. But I try to separate fear and risk, if that makes sense. But that doesn't always work out in the mountains, as we know. I mean, there's a whole chapter called The Pursuit of Fear. I mean, in a way, it's the most historical book I've ever written, and I was writing my PhD in Cambridge at the time I was writing this, and my PhD is just so boring. I mean, it was just astonishingly dull. But I sort of knew how to do it, so I would get on with that in these archives, writing about 19th century literary theory but then in turn in the evenings to this incredible puzzle, like how has it come to this? I mean, I might just read. It's a sort of second cemetery of the evening. Things are going to get cheerier, I promise. But I mentioned Mallerie earlier, and also we were talking about risk taking and style. For those of you who've read it will know, but the last, or the penultimate chapter, is a sort of semi-dramatic recreation in the present tense of the 3 expeditions that Mallerie undertook, that happened in Everest 21, 22 and 24. And there are these incredible letters from Mallerie to Ruth, and sort of saying, I mean, he'd come out of the trenches. It's that great, there's been Into the Silence, the Wade Davis book, is a wonderful exploration of this. But that whole reconfiguration of fear through the 10s and into the 20s is a whole other story. But he kept saying, I won't go again for all the gold in Arabia, and he'd be on the boat on the way back, and then he goes again, and then he comes back, and then he goes again, leaving three children. So this is from the 24 expedition. Things are not going well. Dear girl, Mallerie writes to Ruth on 27th of May, this has been a bad time altogether. I look back on tremendous efforts and exhaustions, and dismal looking out of a tent door onto a world of snow and vanishing hopes. And yet there have been a good many things to set on the other side. And then, as if to reward his refusal to despair absolutely, there is a window in the weather. The wind drops and there's sunshine. This is it. Mallerie writes a penultimate letter to Ruth, telling her that they will make the bid. The candle is burning out and I must stop. Darling, I wish you the best I can, that your anxiety will be at an end before you get this, with the best news, which will also be the quickest. The col is reached and camps are set higher up the ridge. As arranged, the first proper attempt is made by the climbing pair of Somervell and Norton without oxygen. They make good progress, keeping just off the brink of the ridge, where they are out of the wind, but where the terrain is more difficult. It is, writes Norton afterwards, like climbing up giant overlapping roof tiles. There is nothing to grip onto. Everything's trying to shuck you off. Somerville has to stop, but Norton presses on to around 28,000 feet before he realises that he will die if he does not turn back. Precariously, he descends the slabs and meets Somerville, and they descend together back towards the col, with Norton perhaps 20 yards ahead of Somerville. Suddenly, Somerville coughs, hard, agonisingly hard, and he feels something from inside him, some object, detach itself and jam in his throat. He begins to choke to death. He cannot breathe, and nor can he shout to Norton. Norton turns, but thinks that Somerville is hanging back to make a sketch of the mountain. No, he is hanging back to die. He sits down in the snow and watches Norton walk on away from him, and then with a final effort he hammers his chest and throat with his clenched fist and simultaneously coughs as hard as he can, and the thing dislodges itself and jumps into his mouth, and he spits it out onto the snow. It's a chunk of his larynx that's been killed by frostbite. Somerville and Norton descend to base camp, and Irvine and Mallerie prepare to leave the North Col. On the morning of 6th of June, they have a last breakfast of sardines, biscuits and chocolate inside the sagging A-frame tents, and then get out onto the sterile, stamped-down snow of the col to make final preparations for the ascent. Each man has 2 big silver pods of oxygen strapped to a frame on his back. They look like early jetpack willies, as though they could just crank a lever and lift off vertically for the summit. They're wearing thick puttees, mitts and flying ace goggles with silver rims to protect them from snow blindness. They proceed without incident up to camps 5 and 6, and early on the 8th of June they depart for the summit. The air is clear when they begin to climb, but within hours a fine and oddly luminous mist begins to gather around the mountain. Noel Adele, the expedition geologist, watching from a vantage point at 26,000 feet on the mountain, sees 2 black dots moving along the summit ridge, and then the mist closes around them. If that moment sort of again restated for me the madness viewed from the outside, the sort of almost this Joe Simpson calls it the inverted gravity that pulls people upwards. Therefeld Gautier calls it the irresistible passion, and he talks about how the abyss can hold that, but also the peak. And I mean, it's the oldest question in climbing writing, in mountain writing, and someone we both think incredibly highly of, Mike Harrison, M. John Harrison, answered that in fictional form in Climbers. I think you've in Black Car Burning as well. You're thinking very, very hard about that. So different forms give you different ways into the answer to that unanswerable question.
I suppose we can't ever talk about Mallerie without thinking of the phrase "because it's there" as the answer to why we do these things. And almost more interesting than him saying it, because you never know exactly what context that something said, is how we culturally have clung on to that as a kind of... What do you think of "because it's there" as a justification for climbing? He answered it in 3 words, and I decided I'd answer it in 3 pages. And possibly there's nothing to choose between them. But I don't. It doesn't. It's a question that needs repeated answering, and I guess that brings us in some way back to the question of what's changed in 20 years in mountaineering culture, not just in mountaineering culture, but the mountains themselves. Obviously, we're deep in an end game with mountain environments, and mountaineering as a pastime, and all of its kind of cousins and brothers and sisters of pastimes, the biking and the trail running. They're all complicit in this, but also agonized by it. I mean, the glacial retreat. I remember I read. Lopez wrote Arctic Dreams in '86, and reading it now through the lens of an Arctic, which basically doesn't have summer ice coverage. So much of what he saw coming has now happened and accelerated, and I think this book was in a way written in a period of relative innocence. I think I date the
the powerful arrival of sort of climate change consciousness to probably the mid 2000s. I still remember writing a furious op-ed piece about David Cameron. Do you remember when he got flipping David Cameron? Sorry, I just realised he's back in our political. Oh my God! Do you remember that thing with the Huskies? Do you remember? Yeah, sheesh. It's like greening the Tory party, and and they it made me so angry. So I think there is an innocence to this. There's a lot I'd change, I think, if I were to write it now, and a lot has changed since I wrote it.
In terms of mountaineering literature as a field, I always refer to it as if it's its own thing that's separate from other kinds of writing, and maybe that's a bit simplistic. But what do you want to see happen in that genre now, given the new context that we're in 20 years on? What are you, what do you think we need in the genre, or what are you excited about that's being written?
Well, I think, I mean, in a way, I'm the worst. I'm the last person who should say it. I've said my piece. Wonderful things have happened in mountain culture and in mountain literature. I mean, I've got I teach at Cambridge, and I have a dissertation student at the moment who is writing on an incredible tradition of female mountaineering literature that begins with Dorothy Pilley, Climbing Days, moves through Gwen Moffat, Space Beneath My Feet.
Yeah, I always can't remember if it's below or beneath. But
Yeah. And then to Nan Shepherd with The Living Mountain, and then all the way through to Helen's work. And so, wonderful things have happened. And a tradition of female writing about mountains has begun to emerge from shadows that it should never have been in. Incredible female voices and diverse voices beginning to write into mountain literature. I think we all writing about place now is kind of Anthropocene writing. Like it cannot not be conscious of the change that is happening and the acceleration and the complexities of the entanglement. So I think though I wouldn't describe this as blithe at all, it's not really. Yeah, as I say, there was an innocence there, so I think, as it were, materially, very serious things are happening, and I think mountain writing, which is just such a tradition, I mean, such an incredible tradition. I think it is. I mean, cricket literature is really cool. Like cricket has a really cool literature. C.L.R. James, it's highly kind of decolonizing, ahead of time, things like Beyond the Boundary by C.L.R. James. But mountain literature, I think, probably does lay claim to the one of, if not the richest, strangest, most forceful and extensive literatures of a. It's not really a sport, though, is it? It's a faith. I mean,
yeah, definitely, or a kind of affliction sometimes. Yeah. Like writing can feel like an affliction.
It felt like an affliction at kilometre 5 today on the trail run on Scout Scar. Yeah, I was not happy then. But
I think the great thing about, well, again, this is a slightly naive way of looking at it, but the great thing about any thing in publishing is that books are in conversation with other books, and they lead to more books being written, and the conversation gets bigger. And think about your book being in conversation with Barry Lopez, for instance, and then the kind of the influence that Mountains of the Mind has had within that community and beyond. I'm interested in the influence you think this book and its publication has had on you as a writer. And as a person, I suppose, but yeah, was it what you expected? How has it changed what's happened subsequently?
That's a really good question, and not one I've really. I mean, it was in a way, it was this charmed thing. It kind of came out and won a bunch of prizes really fast, and I couldn't keep up, and I was so nervous and little. I remember before the very first event I ever did for it at Hay Festival, I was just abysmally nervous, and I just had to literally go and lie down in a darkened room beforehand, and then stand up and sort of stammer my way through it. So I guess, you know, finding a readership quickly, not all of it approving, and there's a certain kind of toughening process that was undergone as well. I mean, as we both know, being read is really exciting. Like literature lives by communication. I love the photos I get sent of, you know, somebody up at the Khumbu Icefall with a copy, or they come to a reading and they pull out this battered one that's got like river sand and leaves, and they say, I took this here. Somebody took, you know, sledge-hauled one to the South Pole, and I was like, I hope that was on Kindle so that it didn't weigh anything. And he was like, no, it was the real. I was like, you loon, you could have got a much better book out of that 300 grams. But so it gave me a confidence that I would be read, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And I guess you feel that, don't you? Like if a book goes into the void.
And your hope is that it will start. So it's not just in terms of books influencing other books. It's not just that they straightforwardly inspire them. It can be, and I'd always hope to have this kind of vision of my own work, but we all know it's not really like that in real life. You're just scared of critique and stuff. But that it would be a positive thing for books to be written in reaction to, almost like as an argument against, or as this is what's missing, or that. So it kind of becomes a really rich discourse.
Well, that's the dialectic at work, and I think it took me a little time to realise that was, you know, for the greater good, as it were. And I think what I haven't, I mean, I learned so much when I was writing this book. I was studying. Robert Louis Stevenson calls it playing the sedulous ape, basically, where you mimic another writer to learn their skills, and then you gradually gain your own sort of strength in that technique, and then you can do things yourself with it. So I remember reading Barry and Annie Dillard and a few, you know, for Dillard I was like, how do you like absolutely pristinate a scene? How do you make it sing and sparkle with light? And surprise. How do you manage sentence rhythm? And with Barry, he was just so incredibly good at cutting between anthropology, cultural history, political context, ethnography, and then these amazing little kind of inset, jeweled prose poems. And so I would kind of go and I'd be like, how do they do that? It's a magic trick. I want to know the magic trick. So yeah, so I studied them, and then so you gain muscles, as it were. I
do that with M. John Harrison, who you referred to earlier. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons he's so good is that no matter how many times I go back to his novel Climbers, I can't see how he's doing it because it's so good.
No, yeah, that is proper magic. That is, there's no kind of, you know, dove up the sleeve there. That's just magic. So.
And on the train on the way up here, I had my copy of Mountains of the Mind on the table. I was getting some page references and stuff, and at least 2 or 3 people walked past me getting off the train and went, "That's a great book, that is. I love that book." And I was really interested to see that conversation and reaction. What's the best reader reaction you've had, do you think, or the most memorable?
Well, the most memorable came very early on. I've written this preface about how things have changed, personally, environmentally, culturally, in terms of mountain literature. But I have to say, I really love hearing from readers. I remember talking to Barry Lopez and about reader letters, and Barry wrote Arctic Dreams in '86, and then there was no big book until the year before he died, until Horizon, this extraordinary book Horizon, was published in 2019. And I think I worked out why, because he said, we were sitting together and he said, talking about getting letters from readers, he said, yeah, I replied to them, every single one of them. And so I know there are young ears in the audience, so that was the kind of bleep out. But and I just thought, wow, what an amazing thing. And I try to reply to them, but they are wonderful things, aren't they, when they come. But the most complex one was this very long letter from a father whose daughter had died in the mountains. She'd been killed on the descent from a peak in the Cascades, I think. And she had children. She had perhaps in her late 30s. She had 2 children, and there was a photo of her on the summit, fingers up, smiling, couldn't have been happier. And then he went through the book and he wrote, with each chapter, he wrote a page or 2 responding to and thinking with that chapter. And I realized that it wasn't a letter to me at all. It was a letter to himself, and he was trying to make sense of how and why she had died in the hills. And it was clearly a therapeutic, cathartic, painful exercise for him. So I've never forgotten that letter. The other one I should mention is that there is quite an eccentric physicist in Cambridge who nearly won a Nobel Prize and then didn't, and mostly walks around the Cavendish laboratory with an orange crash helmet on. I'm not going to give you his name, but he wrote, when Mountains of the Mind was published, I got a very long document from him as well, and in it he would take sentences from Mountains of the Mind, then he would attribute a numerical value to letters from each of the sentences, and then he would kind of run algorithms on them, and they would always end up with the outputs 666. And then there was a bunch of stuff about seals being clubbed to death as well that I was less clear about, because as far as I remember, there are no seals in Mountains of the Mind. But, so yeah, anyway, that spans the range of reader responses.
Brilliant. I'm aware that we're almost running out of time, and I think you kindly agreed to do another reading. So I can probably squeeze in one last question, if I may, which is just about, I think one of the beautiful things about how Mountains of the Mind is written is that it has an awareness of the subtle, the nuanced context in which we have become fascinated with mountains and in which we express that through climbing. But it interweaves them with moments of pure joy or fear or just being present in the mountains. And that's the kind of poetry that I was responding to when I first read it, and that immediacy in the language as well. And yeah, I just thought I'd love to ask you, what's your favourite day in the mountains been? If you could pick one. That kind of horrible, fiendish question that no one likes.
It's a lovely question. I these days I like to say that my favourite paths are paths that are wide enough for 2 friends to walk together, and I think that's one of the things that's changed in 20 years, is a kind of getting away from the, first to the top, the what does Nan Shepherd call it, the tang of height, the summit fever, the flag plant, that's all gone. And now I just, probably like everyone here, like my favourite day in the mountains is the most recent kind of amazing day but I was with my son, my 17-year-old son Tom, and friends in that amazing cold snap we had in the lakes last December, early December, when it was like -6, no wind, brutally cold but beautifully cold, and we came up and I took him along Striding Edge on a rope in winter, and he was happy as Larry. And then we got up onto the Helvellyn tops, and then just Brockenspector heaven began, and I had that amazing Brockenspector Erie experience where you have yourself or a version of yourself projected onto the mist, and then there are these coronae of glowing kind of rainbow refraction that surround you. And then I had that very uncanny sense of somebody, my inverse, on the other side of whatever that veil was, looking at their shadow and kind of thinking through, and the whole world felt gossamer thin again and wondrous. And then I said to my son, look at this? It's incredible. He's like, yeah, it's all right. Yeah. But I guess the arc of the book is from fear to wonder, and that's been characteristic of, I guess, my journey since then, and perhaps many people's. And Nan Shepherd has been very important to me, as to many others, in sort of hymning the pass as well as the peak, and the wandering as well as the going, and yeah.
I think of one of the Nan Shepherd moments in my life. That's a strange phrase, isn't it? We should all have more Nan Shepherd moments.
Yes.
But of climbing with you in Greenland, and towards the end of the trip, going onto a ledge that was kind of leading up to the summit of the mountain, and everybody deciding to stay on the ledge and not go to the summit.
I remember
and
that.
It was beautiful. It was just a nice kind of thing of being in that environment and just feeling very lucky.
Yeah.
To be there rather than
declining the summit.
Yeah.
Or
maybe we're just very lazy. I don't know. There's always that possibility.
We had a long way to get back to camp as well. Yeah, a lot of glacier. But look, I won't read because we've got about 14 minutes left. No. I would love to. I'd love to answer questions. I'll say if there are no questions, I'll inflict a third reading on you. So. But we can't see anything, so I don't know if it's... great, yeah.
Or maybe we can finish the whole event with a reading. I think that'd be nice. We could do questions and then reading at the end. It's always nice to go out on a reading. But yeah, if anyone would like to ask a question, I'm afraid we haven't got a roving mic, but I will point at you. Yes. Thanks.
I just want to say massive thank you. You talk about mountains in the imagination, and I think all of us, we've got work that really speaks to us, but maybe it's spoken differently through our lives, through the experiences we've had, the unlearning that we've done.
Yep.
Talk about Nan Shepherd. That's a book that The Living Mountain, I reread, and it speaks very differently every time I read it, particularly my familiarity with the Cairngorms, but also as I grow more into a grumpy old woman.
I'll speak a version of the question back.
Yeah. Is there a particular piece of writing that has spoken very differently to you when you reread it?
That's a really good question. So it's a question about how literature moves across time, and how you return to texts that are important to you, but read them differently through as your life changes, as you unlearn and relearn. Yeah, that is a very good question. I suppose. I mean, there's a text like something like Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey, which I think, when I first read it, just mesmerized me for its kind of raspy commitment to protecting the wilderness. And then as I've gone, this is a negative answer to your question, but as I've gone back to it, I've seen more and more problems with it. The way poverty is dealt with, and women are dealt with, and Cactus Ed, as he was called, his prickles became more pointy. That's not a phrase I thought I would find myself using of Ed Abbey, but so I think there's ways in which a political consciousness returns you with disappointment to a text. And then I guess a completely different one is The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, this amazing novel that I read when I was 13 and have kind of gone back and back to and read to my children, and then adapted for a big BBC radio 12-part series. And that remains inexhaustibly wondrous, but always with slightly different angles of wonder. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh yes, there's one right there. Thanks.
We're walking the John Muir Way just now. Doesn't look like it because we're sitting here, but we took a break to come here.
Oh, great.
We're going to go back to it. But as we're walking it, as the father of conservation that John Muir was, and I don't know how much his literature you know about, but anyway, he was right in what he was saying about how nature has to be conserved. And walking the way, I thought it'd be really good for some writer to walk the John Muir Way from a conservationalist point of view, and see the damage that's done, because I personally suffer from a bit of eco-nostalgia, and it's painful to see the rhododendrons and the Himalayan balsam and the peat bog damage. I could go on. It's a sheep-wrecked, toxic tree graveyard. So yeah, his writing really spelled it out 200 years ago.
Well, it sounds like you should write that book.
Nobody will read my stuff. They won't read yours.
I mean, that was a blistering sentence you unfurled on us then. So, but yeah, and the roadies and the Himalayan balsam came back from plant, Hooker and the late 1840s, fascination with plant collecting in the Himalayas, and now looping through the understory and creating these sort of graveyards of darkness in there. And yeah, I mean, it's I think a lot of writing does recognise. I mean, I'm working on a book on rivers at the moment, and which is called "Is a River Alive?", which is about the lives and deaths of rivers and the movement to recognise the rights of nature, particularly the rights of rivers, and recognise them as beings, as entities, as alive. And inevitably, that's deeply caught up with toxicity, destruction, loss, but also inevitably hope. We share our country, this country, with rivers, and rivers are ancient beings, right? They're post Ice Age. They've been the Roding, for example, kind of knackered old river in London has been flowing for probably that course for about 10,000 years, and a Thames Water, a company founded in the late 1990s, has the power to knacker that ancient being. So I think I'm very interested in ways in which a relationship of a kind of resacralized relationship can actually be the basis for meaningful, significant action. And it's happening, I mean, we've seen the cross-party and wide population outrage at what's happened to the rivers in this country. So I think staring, as Donna Haraway calls it, staying with the trouble, like staring the trouble in the face, is really important. So thank you. It's a really good question, and thanks for taking a break. I can see you got.
Well, you're worth it. Books are ace.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, my friend.
Another question there. Sorry for pointing at people. But yeah.
When you were talking before about what you're excited for the future, you said the changing diversity of writers. And lots of the names you mentioned have been Western authors.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just elaborate on if there are any other writers or texts of people not from Western Europe.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. Well, what I will say is there's an amazing flourishing happening in Indian ecological and environmental writing at the moment. Nia Sinha, wild and willful, amazing young writer called Yuvan Avez, who I interviewed here last year, or was it 2 years ago, virtually beamed in from Tamil Nadu. He published a beautiful book called A Naturalist Journal, and he's just publishing a book called Intertidal, which is just dazzlingly good. And Arati Kumar Rao, who has just published a book called Margin Lands, which is about marginal landscapes, both sort of geographically, ecotonally, in the sense of being coastal landscapes or kind of forest into mountain landscapes, and all of the marginalised communities who live and work in them. So amazing things are happening in that country, where it is really dangerous and hard to be an activist. Particularly an environmental activist. The Modi government is so kind of brutal and ruthless in suppressing dissent. The development narrative is so total and bulldozing that, and yet I was out. A third of this book on rivers is set in Tamil Nadu, and I was out working with these young activist groups, Chennai Climate Action Group, some of the deadest rivers that I've ever seen. I mean, and yet they are there. They know that they can't give up. They're fighting for the fisher folk who live or fail to live in those ecologically denuded contexts, but also for the for the more than human communities there. So yeah, look to India, and others will be able to give examples of other. But that's a field I'm particularly engaged with. But it's a really, really good question.
Can I ask
Thank
a
you.
follow-up?
Yeah.
Do you just, maybe not possible to generalise, but with mountain literature, do you see a difference is there a different anything you see differently about how they write about mountains, being non-Western, living in the mountains?
Well, I don't think I'm a good person to answer that. I mean, I think one of the things I would change about this book would be to focus a little bit more on non-Western voices, non-Western presences. It's basically quite Western-centric in that respect. But it's been, this book was adapted into a film by Jen Peedham, who also directed Sherpa, which was a kind of brilliantly political film about Sherpa rights. And so I think that politicization, particularly of a recognition of Sherpa culture, has been really, really, really welcome. So I'm really interested in that culture broadly and its representation. Indeed, I think we have the authors of Sherpa Boys here, possibly today, certainly in yeah, brilliant. I'm going to come and say hi at the end. Oh yeah, at the back there. Yeah. So hello. Excellent. We're going to hear you sing as well tonight. So yeah, thanks. Great questions.
I always think that every literary event should have like a post box or something at the back where everyone can write down the name of a book that they think everyone else should read, that they've just discovered, and therefore the pool of people's reading gets wider.
Yeah.
That's the best thing about being a writer, right? Is that people tell you
you should
things
read
that you've discovered, and the pool of what you're reading gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But we're almost out of time, and it would be great to finish with a reading. Oh, we're going to have one more quick question over there, and then a reading, I think, if that's all right. Last question.
You partially answered the question I had in your response to Kenny's question, but is anything else? Rivers, obviously, some of us will have known that was on the way. But is there anything else that's gaining traction in there?
Oh, in here?
The word process that might come after that.
I'm very focused on finishing the Rivers book. As far as such a turbulent, fast-flowing subject. So that's. Sorry, that was. I think it's a good sign about a subject is you start to speak unconsciously, reflexively about it. But writing that book has been, I've realised, like wading upstream in a very fast river. Because things are changing so fast, so many court cases coming through, so much activism on the ground, Ecuador. So yeah, it's a really live and exciting area. I've often lost my footing with it, but I've always known you look ahead and the river shows you the path. And and then there's an opera, there's a play, there's a big book with Jackie Morris that we're finally finishing, called the Book of Birds or the Lost Birds. Don't know quite what it'll be yet. And a graphic novel and a couple of albums. So that's August. That's by August. So I'm getting a little bit scared. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions.
Yeah,
can we finish with the reading? That'd be wonderful.
It's the end of the book, really, and it's about wonder, and I guess probably everyone in this room at some level is drawn to the hills because they're wondrous. It's on Benachoran, Hill of the Rowan. It's the one. It's the one near Loch Lagan. It's winter. The wind was blowing along the ridge towards me, and under its invisible pressure, everything was on the move. Millions of particles of snow dust streamed just above the ground in a continuous flow. Rounded chunks of old, hard snow were being blown reluctantly along, skidding over the surface of the ridge, and the big, soft flakes which were falling from the sky were being driven into me by the wind, walloping almost soundlessly against my clothing, and I built up a thin fur of snow on my windward side. I could see no more than 5 yards in any direction, and I felt excitingly alone. The world beyond the world snow became unimportant, almost unimaginable, and I could have been the last person on the planet. I reached the small summit plateau of the mountain and stopped. A few paces away, sitting and contemplating me, hunkered back on its huge hind legs, its tall ears twitching, was a snow hare. It seemed curious at this apparition on its mountain top, but unalarmed. The hair was a clean white all over, except for its black tail, a small patch of grey on its chest, and the 2 black rims of its ears. It moved on a few paces in its odd gait, its rear legs shunting its hind quarters slowly forwards and up almost over its head. And then it stopped again, and for half a minute we stood there in the blowing snow, in the strange silence of the snowstorm, me with my clown's mouth of ice and my fur of snow, and the hare with its lush white coat and polished black eyes. And then my friends emerged like spectres from the whiteout, their climbers' hardware clanking, and immediately the hare kicked away with a spurt of snow, swerving and zigzagging off into the blizzard delicately but urgently, its black tail bobbing long after its body had disappeared. I stayed on the top of the mountain for a while, let the others walk on to begin the descent, and thought about the snow hare, about how for an animal like this to cross one's path was to be reminded that it had a path too, that I had crossed its path as much as it mine. And then my mind moved away from the mountaintop, and the solitude I'd experienced in the whiteout on the ridge had been replaced by a sense of the distance invisibly before me, and I no longer felt cocooned by the falling snow. I felt accommodated by it and extended by it, part of the hundreds of miles of landscape over which it was falling. I thought east to where the snow would be falling over the ancient granite backs of the Cairngorm Mountains. I thought north to where the snow would silently be covering the empty wilderness of the monoliths, the grey hills. I thought west to where snow would be falling on the great peaks of the rough bounds of Knoydart, Larven, the hill of the Claw, and Linnevan, the hill of Anger. I thought of the snow falling across ridge on ridge of the invisible hills, and I thought that there was nowhere at that moment that I would rather be.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Book Festival and the Mountain Festival. Thank you to all of you for coming. And most importantly, thank you to Robert Macfarlane.
Helen as well.
Book signing.